Okay, so welcome everyone to our presentation on the Code of Practice for Agriculture Environmental Management. And this specific topic has to do with nutrient application and record keeping regulations. So this is kind of a, talking about regulations is not the most easiest thing. It has to deal with going through the Code of Practice for Agriculture Environmental Management, which was adopted in 2019 by the BC Ministry of Agriculture and also Environment. And it is a 49-page document that I am very well acquainted with. And the wonderful thing is that it's a lot shorter than what it used to be. And many people don't know that there are new governmental regulations out there that has to do with the environment. But this is where we do a lot of our outreach with local residents. We are mostly focusing on, the area that we're in. So I'm in the city of Abbotsford. We touch on Langley, Surrey, and other particular waterways that have had high fecal coliform counts for people who have horses, dairy, dog waste, and really just trying to educate people on best management practices when it comes to, we talk about feces and other things. So nutrient application record keeping. Who would have thought that we would have been having to record how often we apply manure to our properties, our fields, and our practices? But the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Environment is trying to give us a little bit of a nudge up about how we should be practicing, but not everybody knows the information. And I don't really think everybody wants to read a 49-page document. So anyway, I know people watching this may not always deal with horses or other animals. They could be bringing on additional composting units onto their property or being gifted things. And some people who are watching this may not have waterways on their property that flow south, because always water flows down. So this is going to be pretty much as I can do, all inclusive, to try to understand the Code of Practice and make it applicable to us, because we all live in municipalities that have very specific ideas, and they adopt their own policies when it comes to agriculture. There is a topic that is usually referred to as the Good Neighbor Policy, and that's not in the Code of Practice. But what we're finding as LEPS, so my name is Amanda, and I work for the Land Labor Partner Society. And we call it just LEPS as an acronym, but it is an environmental organization. And when we found out that the Ministry of Agriculture and Environment had changed the Code of Practice to make it a little bit more easy to read, we started doing outreach. And I think it helps everybody when we all know the information. Usually when I'm recording, I'm gonna usually have some glitches. I'm going to probably stop sharing, and I'm going to go again. Okay. So the Code of Practice for Agriculture and Environmental Management, that's the title page to it. And if you're not acquainted with it, I think it's a bit of an easy read, but being 49 pages, you watching this may not feel that it is. But the reason why they changed and updated the regulations is because the old copies were a little bit hard to digest and read. And I feel that this code is a lot more easier to understand. I don't come from a science background, but when I first read it and adopted all of the policies to rewrite the LEPS Land Management Guide for horse owners and small lot farmers, I found it very easy to read and without a problem to adapt some of the codes that were in there. But the number one thing when you go through that code is that it does focus more on soil testing. So it depends on really how large your site is, if you have a field, if you are leasing, and even if you don't have a certain proximity, like usually, when you read the code, you're seeing, soil testing requirements more than 5 hectares, and that would be 12 acres. We have to kind of read through these regulations and sort of figure out what is more impactful to us as farmers. Now, the soil testing is important, knowing the nutrient results. So testing your soil, you need to be able to go to a provider to give you more of a clear sort of, understanding about what nutrients you have in there, especially if you have recently bought or sold, or you just put down manure and you didn't know you were supposed to test that manure. So it all kind of comes into play. We also have within this code a protection of water courses and waterways. So depending on where you're reading in the code, you will see wording like, environmental impact, but then you'll read somewhere else in the code, cannot come into water courses. So when we think about environment, be thinking about the air, the land, and the water. I think that that's going to be the most important, because while they made the Ministry of Agriculture and Environment did the best they could to make this easy to read, you have to sort of read between the lines still a little bit. So when they refer to no impact on the environment, they literally do mean air, land, and water. And water is the most important as we go through this particular presentation. Now, also, when you read through this, there are some other acts that come through. So I know that the Water Sustainability Act is mentioned because groundwater and surface water is very important. So if anybody is on a well, you have to be able to test your well. And there are many resources that LEPS has, so that's Land Environment Partner Society. So when we record this workshop, it's going to be put on our YouTube channel, and we actually have other things based on septics and wells, which is pretty exciting. So, when we talk about nutrient application, we have to think about, properties that people may have, and really, what is a nutrient management plan? People actually do have nutrient management plans. If you are putting down fertilizer, if you are putting down manure of any kind, you might be landing yourself in an area where it is a vulnerable aquifer. So I have a list here in the photo, and the wording literally comes that I have on the screen right from the AEM Code of Practice. So that wording literally is whoever needs a nutrient management plan, so a plan to apply fertilizer or manure to your property for growing food, is a person who applies nutrient sources to a field must have a nutrient management plan if all of the following conditions are met. So you may find that you're not in this category, and we're going to go into that. So number one, the field is a part of an agricultural operation, having an agricultural land base totaling 5 hectares or more. And that would be about like 2.5, 2.2 acres. The field is located in a vulnerable aquifer recharge area shown on that particular map, B1, and that actually is on your screen right now for you to look at. So I know that I didn't really crop this to the best of my ability here, but when you look at Schedule B, the vulnerable aquifer recharge areas, if you find yourself in any of these territories in the province of British Columbia, you are within that area. So we are within the Abbotsford, Langley, Surrey, and Chilliwack areas, being the Fraser Valley. If you are watching this video anywhere north or in the East Kootenays, you may see the place that you may be listed in. And the one thing that I want to note about this So you may see in column 3 that list was updated as of February 28th in 2019. That's when this act was adopted. So today in the Fraser Valley, we had a little bit of a snow day today. When you go to the actual AEM code that is online all the time, and I'll go back to the chat once we're finished this recording, you'll have a link to it. They actually update that AEM code every single day if there's changes. So right now, Abbotsford and Langley have been stuck in this sort of position where we are in vulnerable aquifer areas, but there may be some changes. So what I will do is I'm going to share my, when I stop sharing my screen, you'll be able to see in the chat and go right to the current AEM code and see what changes that are there. So this particular graph that is always in print, if you want to print it out or view it online, it is literally on page 41 out of 49 pages of the AEM code, just to kind of give you a little bit more of a heads up and a bit of a cheat to see that you don't have to read through all of those pages. The other thing that you need to keep in mind, and I already mentioned doing soil tests, is that if you do your soil test and it comes out that you have a nitrate test for a particular field that is, 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare or more, you're going to have to really have a nutrient management plan. We need to regulate really some of the nutrients going into our waterways, especially if you find yourself on this Schedule B map. So what about these nutrient management plans? There is a lot of places in British Columbia where we are not urbanized. We have open fields, and especially really in the Fraser Valley, which is where we're mostly talking about because we're flowing directly into the United States, all of our creeks and watercourses, but we do get things from upwards in the northern areas of BC, but regardless of that, we see a lot of sites like this where people are just dumping manure in a pile. Looks like a good pile. Looks like it's the summertime, but it's one of these scenes that when we're in a rural area we see quite often. So nutrient management plans, that we can be applying nutrients. And when they mean nutrients, they mean really manure or fertilizers. But in that vein, if we're not really a professional, we could be professional growers, but we don't know about what our growing practices are doing to our local environment. So on page 30, and I always make sure when I do AEM code presentations, I always make sure I put page number in that code, because so this is not something that LEPS thinks that we're going to put in just to make sure we are making sure that everybody is doing good practices, but we actually make sure that we put the page number down in the AEM code. So any kind of nutrient management plan should be prepared by a qualified professional if the land is more than 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare or more, and it should be by someone who is fairly experienced. So if you do know someone who has done soil testing before, that's wonderful. If you do not, then you probably should contact your local municipality to see who can do any water quality testing or soil testing. So really the whole thing about, coming up with a plan is that you have to get your soil tested. It's a low cost. It's usually anywhere between, the municipality that you're in, it could be anywhere from $40 to $80, but it's very worthwhile, and they can help you out. So you don't have to call someone in like a contractor to do your soil test. You literally can do it yourself if you contact someone who does do the soil test in the chemical lab. They'll tell you actually how to do it, but it's very important that you test your soil. Now, once you've tested your soil, Or sometimes you might say, no, I don't really feel like it. This really only comes up when you are under 12 hectares or 12 acres or 5 hectares. It does really decide on how large your property is and if you're in a vulnerable aquifer. So anybody really in the Fraser Valley should be testing it unless you're in that list, which I can go back to if anybody wants to see it again. So if you're in here, you're in that vulnerable aquifer, you'll need to get your soil tested once a year for sure. And then, in the same way that people test wells, Fraser Health says 2 times per year, although really on paper it's 1, and that can go for, Coastal Health and all of the other health agencies. They'll probably say the same thing. So soil tests are important, but yeah, so if you are under your 12 acres, you may think, well, you know what, I can pretty much handle it. It's a small area. I don't have to deal with it. But if you land yourself within that vulnerable aquifer, you may want to have a little bit of an insurance policy in your back pocket. And that comes to record keeping. And that was one of the things that we really wanted to focus on today. So we already know that we can't be applying certain things, depending on our soil test, knowing how big our property is. But there are regulations on distributing manure and fertilizer, which is a whole other topic, which is actually in the AEM code. And if anybody has any questions on that, definitely ask me after this presentation. But the thing is, with applying any kind of fertilizer to your property, if you're in that vulnerable aquifer, you need to keep record keeping. And that goes if you have a soil test or not. So over 12 acres or even under, it's best that you keep a record keeping book. Now, this is where we did a presentation on January 17th on stream setbacks. And that one was, I think, probably more attended in the moment because there are a lot of people within the area of Abbotsford, Langley, and Surrey that, because we have so many waterways, we have over 1,800 kilometers of waterways that float within our area and that also drain into the state of Washington. But it was interesting that people didn't quite know about doing soil tests. And I got questions after the fact about if we are horse owners or dairy owners or, even excess chicken, because some people actually have excess chicken manure, what do we do with it and where do we take it? So there were a lot of questions after the fact about what do we do with all of our manure, because people don't really know. But also we were doing site consultations and we found that there were a lot of berry growers that took out trees and planted blueberries right down to the top of the stream. And they didn't realize that it mattered how much fertilizer they were using on their blueberries. So more education and more soil testing is so important. So we know that nothing bad will happen. And I have a little screen kind of coming up, which will show you what happens when we don't really regulate and know what we're applying on our land. So record keeping is very important. Now, the ministry has not given any examples of what kind of record keeping they're looking for. LEPS has made it fairly easy. So anybody who's watching this particular webinar recording, please let me know if you want a copy of a sheet. I'll show you what it looks like after. But all you have to do with that good neighbor policy, because people will watch, especially if there's an agricultural, area and people are all farming and some of them are doing the good practices and some of them are not. Good neighbor policy is important because they will report it to somewhere. So there is the RAP line and there are the local municipalities. So if there's no permitting for anything, And it does sort of look a little funny. So especially if you have a water course and the water courses, this doesn't look normal. You have that neighbor policy that may be like, oh, well, I don't want that. I don't want anybody to know that it's me. What if it's my neighbor? I better tell someone. But if you are laying down manure or any fertilizers, record keeping is very important. So notating the dates, the type of application, whether it's manure or fertilizer, what kind of fertilizer is it? What kind of manure is it? And usually when you lay down manure, you need to actually test it yourself, bringing either in to a lab, and there are some at-home tests. And if you are using an at-home test, you may want to notate it on your record keeping, but how much that you were laying down per cubic meter. That's very important. If you want a copy of the stream setbacks, but I also included other setbacks. So if you are on, a well property or in septic, knowing your setbacks is very important. So that's where we want to kind of couple that into knowing how much manure or fertilizer you're laying down per cubic meter, and also include your address because someone else may do a soil test. So it's good that you do it too, especially if there are any problems. So keep your login book on site or in your home. And if you are under your 12 acres, you be like, well, I'm not going to do a soil test. Heck no, but you still are going to be landing yourself in the category where we have, we're in a small scale farming area. So, I mean, I think that when I look back at some of the farms that are in the Langley Township area, Abbotsford and Surrey, we can go from 2 acres to 50 acres or 100 acres, but it's not as large as other areas in British Columbia and in Canada. So this is the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Environment that have these regulations. So if you are in a different province, it may differ for you slightly, depending on how many water courses you have. So ours is a little bit more sort of strongly guided, as you would say. So under 12 acres, if you say, no, I will not do a soil test, you should still be doing some kind of record keeping, because again, you are sharing a property boundary with someone and you're farming or doing some agricultural practices and you're laying down manure or fertilizer and you have a water course somewhere close by. You do not want to get to that point where your neighbor says, hey, that kind of result in the water course is not me. Due to my practices, is it you? And it's just a way for you to keep yourself safe if it gets to a higher point or if they report you to the RAP line. So this, I think, is really something that you should take the environmental code of practice and think about, well, what am I doing on my property? And how is it impacting others? That's the thing. So when we have water that flows down into our rivers, our streams, and our creeks that flow south into differing provinces or states, if we're going into a different country, we could be impacting another, food industry. So for us in the Lower Fraser Valley, we all of our practices on our farms somehow are impacting the shellfish industry in the state of Washington in Boundary Bay. And we're working very closely with the state of Washington to do water quality tests to see exactly what is happening. So this record keeping logbook is very important. Now I have kind of a version of a record keeping sheet if you would like to see it, and it's right here. And this looks fairly complicated. And I think that maybe this might be too much information because the BC Ministry of Agriculture isn't probably looking for this much in depth, but I think it is as detailed as more detail is better than not giving enough, as you may say. So all we have is just your basic farm name, your physical address of that farm, what is the year, and then the field number. So anybody who is, let's say, if you have 12 acres or more, you may not have one lot, That's 12, you may have it fenced or somehow delineated. So you are doing a crop rotation and you may have 3 fields, or you may have a grazing pasture and then 1 growing field, or it's all just pasture. You still may have field numbers. So write down per field number which one it is. You'll need to have a record keeping sheet for each field you have. And you may want to notate the size. Now, I still deal with acres. I'm still kind of in the imperial system, and I do the conversion every time I need to go to metric. So as long as you can put something in there that is what you're measuring in, anybody can do the conversion over to cubic meters. And then you literally go on that first category there, the application date. So even though you may have the year on there, it doesn't have the date or the month. So that's when you put that in. The type of application. So are you laying manure down? Or are you just doing fertilizer? Is it, to the next column, a little bit more detailed, liquid or compost? You could even write in that type of application if it's granular. That's okay too. Now they have a calculation rate, and I will be following up with anybody that's on this particular Zoom meeting. And also when we share it to our YouTube channel, I'm going to be having the nutrient application tool that is something that you can do online. You don't have to figure it out with the meters per, cubic meters on here. You may just want to say like how much you're putting down. The BC Ministry of Agriculture and Environment does not care how specific you are. They would like you to be as specific as possible, but trying to do some sort of record keeping will help them immensely. Because the last thing you want is some sort of compliance officer coming up to you and saying, well, what have you done on your property? And all you can do is verbiage. You don't have anything dated, which is very, very important. And fascinatingly enough, they also have here your most recent soil test and when. So they just want to make sure that you're up on your farming practices if indeed you are farming. Well, the other piece of this is, why do you really want to test your soil? We've already said that that's what you have to do in terms of the regulation, but really, why do you have to? So the major thing when you read the AEM code, there are so many things that are in common that come up in different areas, and they all come down to not being able to have any runoff or leaching into groundwater or surface water. That is the major piece of this. So that is why the soil tests are important. Knowing what nutrients that you are applying and what is in your soil. If you want to, again, see like the stream setback one, that kind of couples this particular one that we're talking about in terms of nutrient application, but they really work together within the same code. There are 2 nutrients that we really want to watch that's in our soil, and especially if we are applying any sort of manure, whether that be horse, dairy, or chicken, and phosphorus. So that would mostly come from different fertilizers that we are applying to, let's say, berry fields. And well, I've been applying fertilizers in my various veggie fields, but other people may be applying it too. So we want to minimize the risk. So both nitrogen and phosphorus are very important for plant health, but there's a point where you can apply too much. So that's what the Ministry of Agriculture does not want you to do. So what is the result of applying excess fertilizer or any sort of nutrients? When we have excessive rains or flooding, and we are in farming areas that are kind of low-lying or they are downward sloping, and we're applying nutrient sources to our land, this is what we could get if we're not very calculated in how much we're applying. So nobody really wants to see this in their local water courses, but it's one thing that can happen, and that's what we have to be very careful about. this particular scene is too much phosphorus. However, when you have too much nitrogen, it can also look close, but slightly different. But when you see muddy, clear, or even color in water, it's not the best thing. It should be very clear and freely running, and that is not this. So why are we doing this outreach? That's probably the most important thing, is that, you know, LEPS, being the Langley Environmental Partner Society, is doing this outreach, and we work very closely with the Forest Council of BC and any other farming commodity groups as much as we can to get the word out from the BC Ministry of Agriculture, and also adapt some resources that are very clear and easy to read on our own behalf. So we have a land management guide that I had put in the chat, and there's also this particular regulation that we've been referring to. So I really like the land management guide, which I did put in the chat, and we also can put in the notes when we put this particular video on YouTube, that this particular resource actually deals with the Weed Management Act and also the Drinking Water Act and so much more. So we actually have coupled all of our regulations into this, so everybody has a good understanding. But the reason why we're doing this regulation, this whole outreach, is because we had a grant project, and it came from Environment Canada, which was Climate Change Canada. It's a federal grant, and it had to do with the fecal coliforms in our own little watersheds, which is Little Campbell, Bertrand, and Fish Trap in Abbotsford and Langley. And we have 2 more months to reach out to as many farmers as we can to tell them some of these new regulations and to create awareness. We have quite a few webinars already on our LEPS YouTube channel, but we have more coming up in March and April. And if anybody's interested in more informative webinars, you can let me know. But this is, I know that I've got some text on the screen, but this is the good stuff that we want to see. And one thing that we don't want to forget is we do not spread manure between October and March. So those are our wet months. And if we know anything about water, it likes to absorb what it can, and then it takes that absorption and all the nutrients and it flows into water courses or into septic fields or close to a well. So we want to make sure that we are very careful with our practices on our properties. So that is our presentation today. I will see if I can stop this video recording. And then we can have some questions.